The sun had barely risen over Ouagadougou when the world woke up to a shock that rattled corridors of power in Paris. Ibrahim Traoré, already a figure of audacious resolve in Burkina Faso, had just rewritten the rules of the Sahel. He didn't whisper. He didn't negotiate in shadows. He came for sovereignty, and the first proof was already blazing across headlines. Chad, under its president's bold hand, was joining the Alliance of Sahel States. This wasn't just an alliance, this was a declaration. A line drawn in the sand against decades of French influence that had long dominated African politics from afar. In the marble halls of France, the news landed like a thunderclap. Analysts scrambled, diplomats panicked, and intelligence networks flickered with uncertainty. The AES was no longer a whispering coalition. It had teeth, it had weight, and most importantly, it had momentum. What no one expected was the speed and decisiveness with which Traoré orchestrated this move. Across the Sahel, leaders whispered of a new era, an Africa willing to take back its narrative, willing to challenge the lingering shadows of colonial influence. Traoré's vision wasn't just political. It was cinematic in its audacity. He understood the optics, the psychology, and the historical resonance of this partnership. By bringing Chad into the AES, he transformed a regional bloc into a continental symbol of defiance. This wasn't just a maneuver on a geopolitical chessboard, this was a broadcast to the world. African nations would no longer play by rules written for them by others. The alliance sent ripples through capitals across Europe and Africa alike. Citizens in Burkina Faso watched with a mixture of awe and pride, seeing in their leader someone who was willing to confront the old powers not with timid diplomacy, but with audacious strategy. Is this the turning point or the start of something darker? Drop your take, because what comes next is even more unreal. Behind closed doors in the AES, strategy sessions hummed with tension. Traoré's approach was simple yet revolutionary. Solidarity, coordination, and a relentless focus on sovereignty. Each country that joined strengthened a wall that France could no longer scale without consequence. With Chad's military and strategic position now aligned, the AES could project power and influence across the Sahel in ways that were previously unthinkable. This alliance didn't just protect borders. It challenged decades of external intervention and reshaped expectations for African leadership on the global stage. Public reactions were electric. Social media erupted as citizens across the Sahel shared images of Traoré standing defiantly. His posture a message itself. He's built different, and the world just found out why. Analysts debated the implications. Could this be the blueprint for a new African geopolitical era? Could AES become the nucleus of a continental shift where sovereignty trumps old hierarchies and former powers are left recalculating their influence? In the streets of Ouagadougou and N'Djamena, everyday people felt the pulse of history under their feet. France, long accustomed to playing the lead role in West African politics, now faced a reality they hadn't fully anticipated: uncertainty. The AES was no mere coalition of convenience. It was a statement, a movement, a challenge, promised resilience, unity, and a vision that rejected interference. Traoré and his allies had ignited a geopolitical spark that could either flare into continental solidarity or ignite tense confrontations over influence and control. Every decision now mattered. Every alliance, every move in the Sahel carried weight far beyond borders. Traoré's audacity had shifted the entire narrative. The old order was no longer unchallenged. A new chapter was being written, one where African nations could dictate the terms of their own destiny. Citizens watched, opponents bristled, and the world leaned in, captivated, concerned, and unprepared for the force of determination sweeping the region. The moment was electric. In the arid plains of the Sahel, as the sun cast long shadows over Burkina Faso and Chad, the unthinkable had become reality. Ibrahim Traoré and Chad's president had sealed a partnership that would reverberate far beyond their borders. This wasn't just a handshake. It was a seismic shift in the balance of power, a move that strengthened military coordination and political solidarity in a region long watched and often dictated by distant powers. You'll see why this alliance is being called the most consequential in the Sahel in decades. AES, already a coalition of ambition and defiance, suddenly had a broader strategic footprint. Where once each nation struggled alone against threats, now there was unity, a coordinated force capable of deterring any external challenge. Traoré had built more than a political front. He had created a shield, a network that sent a simple, uncompromising message. African nations were no longer waiting for permission to defend their own. Every base, every maneuver, every intelligence-sharing protocol was a step toward autonomy. This wasn't just strategy, it was sovereignty in motion. In the streets of Ouagadougou and N'Djamena, citizens watched with awe as military convoys moved with purpose, a silent testament to the new era dawning over the Sahel. Analysts in Paris and Brussels felt a chill. France's historical influence, carefully cultivated over decades, was facing unprecedented erosion. The AES wasn't just talking about collective defense. They were signaling readiness to act decisively, to protect borders, and to assert political will without deference to old hierarchies. This wasn't just a coalition, it was a warning. Is this the turning point or the start of something even more dramatic? Drop your take, because what comes next is set to rewrite the rules of regional power. Behind the scenes, the alliance had transformed into a well-oiled machine. Military coordination meant synchronized exercises, intelligence sharing, and a rapid response capability that few had predicted. Traoré's leadership style, direct and unyielding, ensured that political solidarity wasn't just rhetoric. Every communiqué, every joint statement, reinforced the idea that the Sahel could now act in unison, both on the battlefield and at the negotiation table. France and other traditional powers were confronted not by isolated nations, but by a cohesive bloc that could anticipate, respond, and retaliate if provoked. Across the region, the atmosphere was tense yet electrifying. Soldiers understood the stakes. Citizens felt the surge of collective agency. Traoré had proven he was built different, and the world just found out why. He wasn't leading a country. He was leading a movement, one where political ambition and military readiness intertwined to form a shield around African sovereignty. The AES's expanded footprint was more than geography. It was a statement, a strategic map of power drawn by the people who actually lived under its skies. Political analysts scrambled to recalibrate their models. Could this cohesion hold under pressure? Could AES deter foreign interference without fragmenting under internal rivalries? Every decision from Traoré's office, every movement of troops along shared borders, became a signal to the world. Africa was no longer content to be a theater for external agendas. Sovereignty was being defended with intent, coordination, and visible strength. Is this the blueprint for a new Sahel, united and unyielding, or the spark of future confrontations? Share your predictions, the next chapter is already unfolding. As the sun set, painting the desert in gold and blood-orange hues, the ES alliance stood firm. Traoré and his counterparts had ignited a quiet revolution of readiness, a pact that blended political vision with military might. France's shadow receded as the Sahel emerged with clarity and confidence. Borders were no longer lines on a map dictated from afar. They were defended, coordinated, and sovereign. Every eye in the region was now on the alliance, waiting to see how decisively it would act. The message was unmistakable. This is Africa reclaiming its future, together, without compromise, and ready for whatever comes next. The moment broke like a storm over the Sahel. Ibrahim Traoré stood resolute in Ouagadougou, the weight of history behind him. As the news rippled across the continent, Chad had officially joined the Alliance of Sahel States. This wasn't ceremonial. This was a seismic declaration. Africa's rising confidence had a name, and it was Traoré. In uniting with Chad, he was not just building an alliance. He was signaling to the world that African nations would no longer accept interference in their political or security affairs. You'll see why this is being called one of the most consequential shifts in modern African geopolitics. France, long accustomed to influence that spanned decades, suddenly found itself facing the unexpected. A united front of African nations daring to chart their own course. What no one anticipated was the speed and decisiveness of Traoré's maneuver. The old structures of dependency were cracking, replaced by a coalition that could act, respond, and defend with precision. In the streets of Ouagadougou and N'Djamena, Citizens watched with a mixture of pride and awe as this new era of autonomy dawned. Every joint statement, every coordinated military exercise, every strategic communique reinforced a single truth. Africa was awake, and it was asserting its sovereignty. Is this the start of a continental renaissance or the spark of future conflicts? Drop your take, because what unfolds next will shock even the most seasoned observers. Behind closed doors, the AES leadership was already moving fast. Traoré's vision was clear: unity, self-reliance, and strategic autonomy. The partnership with Chad was more than symbolic. It expanded operational reach, bolstered military coordination, and created a political front capable of withstanding external pressure. France's influence, once nearly untouchable, was now being tested like never before. Every decision made by Traoré and his counterparts sent ripples through capitals in Europe, signaling that African nations could, and would, defend their borders, their interests, and their dignity. The public reaction was electric. Social media across the continent lit up with images of Traoré and Chad's president standing side by side, a visual testament to a new Africa, confident, unyielding, and prepared to act. Analysts debated the implications. Could this coalition redefine power dynamics across the continent? Could AES inspire other nations to reclaim agency over their own futures? In villages, cities, and capitals across Africa, people were seeing for the first time that sovereignty wasn't just a word, it was an actionable, enforceable reality. Traoré had proven yet again that he's built different, and the world just found out why. He wasn't simply negotiating, he was rewriting the rules. With Chad by his side, the Sahel became a stage for strategic autonomy, a region where political decisions were made by Africans, for Africans. Military coordination was no longer fragmented. It was precise, deliberate, and ready to respond to any incursion or interference. The AES footprint now projected both power and confidence, signaling that Africa could protect its own without external oversight. Is this a long-awaited tipping point for continental unity or the opening of tense geopolitical clashes? Share your thoughts, because the next chapter is already being written in real time. Every handshake, every statement, every troop movement became more than routine. It was history in motion. France, once the arbiter of post-colonial influence, watched as a new narrative unfolded. An Africa that embraced self-reliance, unity, and sovereignty. The Traoré-Chad partnership exemplified a broader awakening, one where African nations refused to be pawns and instead demand a seat at the table on their own terms. Borders were no longer abstract. They were defended, coordinated, and respected by those who lived behind them. As the sun set over the Sahel, painting the land in deep golds and fiery reds, the AES stood firm, a symbol of Africa's rising confidence. The alliance wasn't just a political maneuver. It was a statement, a promise, and a challenge. Sovereignty was no longer negotiable. Unity was no longer optional. Strategic autonomy had arrived, and with it, a continent ready to reclaim its destiny, on its own terms, for the first time in decades. The world blinked, and the Sahel had changed forever. Ibrahim Traoré, standing tall in the heat-soaked capital of Burkina Faso, had just pulled off a move that no one outside Africa saw coming. Chad had joined the Alliance of Sahel States. This wasn't protocol or politicking. This was a seismic pivot, a declaration that Africa could rise together and claim influence on a scale that demanded global attention. The alliance was more than a regional power play. It was a statement to the world that the continent would no longer wait in the wings while decisions about its future were made elsewhere. You'll see why this is rewriting the rules of engagement for international politics. Paris, London, and Washington watched uneasily as the AES began to consolidate its voice. Traoré and Chad's president had coordinated in a way that made it clear. Africa was capable of collective action, and it was done on its own terms. France, whose historical role in the region had once seemed untouchable, faced a dual challenge, a reputational blow and a strategic dilemma. The alliance's growing cohesion was not only defensive, it was proactive, signaling to foreign powers that African nations could now leverage unity to assert influence globally. Citizens across the Sahel felt the electricity of history. witnessing their leaders orchestrate a shift in continental power that seemed almost cinematic in its boldness. Is this the turning point for Africa's geopolitical resurgence, or the spark of tension with former powers? Drop your take, because what comes next is set to change everything. Behind the headlines, the AES machinery was moving fast. Traoré's vision was more than political. It was operational. Military coordination, intelligence sharing, and synchronized policy positions were strengthening the alliance's footprint. This was a coalition capable of action, a bloc that could protect borders, defend interests, and project influence beyond its immediate region. The global implications were stark. African nations could now negotiate from a position of strength, where regional unity translated into credibility, leverage, and the ability to shape international decisions. Traoré's leadership style, decisive, unapologetic, unflinching, turned a partnership into a symbol of Africa's rising power. Social media ignited. Citizens celebrated not just a political maneuver, but a moment of continental pride. Images of Traoré and Chad's president standing side by side became emblematic of a new Africa. Confident, assertive, and strategically minded. Analysts scrambled to reframe their models, trying to account for a region that no longer deferred to external influence, that could now chart its own course with clarity and conviction. Every headline, every commentary, every discussion from Dakar to Addis Ababa reflected a growing acknowledgement. Africa's voice had gained weight on the global stage. Is this the blueprint for long-term continental unity or a flashpoint for international tension? Weigh in, because the unfolding story will define a generation. Every action taken by AES resonated far beyond the Sahel. Political analysts noted that the alliance's ability to project coordinated influence gave African nations leverage they had never wielded before. Trade negotiations, military cooperation, and diplomatic engagement could now occur under a unified banner. France's traditional leverage was waning as AES members prepared to defend not just their borders but their political and economic autonomy. The partnership wasn't just reactive. It was anticipatory, a clear signal that Africa was no longer a passive observer of global affairs. As dusk fell over Ouagadougou and N'Djamena, the alliance's presence felt tangible, almost cinematic. Borders were defended not by fear, but by unity. Political influence was asserted not with submission, but with confidence. Military coordination was visible not as a show of force alone, but as a manifestation of strategic autonomy. The Traoré-Chad alliance had achieved what few thought possible. It had made Africa's rising influence impossible to ignore, turning the continent from a stage of past struggles into an active player on the global chessboard.